Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books. And Charis Books is delighted to welcome Gwendolyn Kiste in conversation with Addie Tsai for a celebration of their respective novels, Reluctant Immortals and Unwieldy Creatures, each of which takes its cues from classic works of horror and literature and remixes them to make new feminist meanings. So, it's remixing right now. So first, I'm going to introduce Gwendolyn, who is in my middle. I think it'll show up in your middle as well. Gwendolyn is the Bram Stoker award-winning author of The Rust Maidens and Her Smile Will Untether the Universe, as well as Pretty Marys All in a Row, The Invention of Ghosts, Bone Set and Feathers, and of course, Reluctant Immortals. Her short fiction and nonfiction have appeared in Nightmare Magazine, Tor's Nightfire, and Strarian, I'm saying that wrong, Black Static, Daily Science Fiction, Unnerving, Inner Zone, and Lamplight, as well as Flame Tree Publishing's Gothic fantasy series, among others. Originally from Ohio, she now resides on an abandoned horse farm outside of Pittsburgh with her husband, 2 cats, and not nearly enough ghosts. You can also find her online at Facebook and on Twitter, and so I'll put her handle in the chat so you can follow her. We are joined as well by Addie Tsai, who uses any and all pronouns. Addie is a queer, non-binary artist and writer of color. They collaborated with Dominic Walsh Dance Theater on Victor Frankenstein and Camille Claudel, among others. Addie has an MFA in creative writing from Warren Wilson College and a PhD in dance from Texas Women's University. She is the author of the queer Asian young adult novel Dear Twin. Unwieldy Creatures is their adult queer biracial retelling of Frankenstein, and it is just out from Jaded Ibis Press. They are the fiction co-editor and editor of features and reviews at Anomaly, staff writer at Spectrum South, and founding editor and editor-in-chief at Just Femme and Dandy. So welcome to you both. I'm so excited for this conversation. I am a horror nerd, but I really want my horror to be interesting and to have things to say about the world. I'm not just a slasher fan, so though sometimes that can be the ticket. But in my horror reading, I want my books to be thoughtful about the world that we're living in. And just judging from our conversation in the green room where we're talking about, the atrocities of the world, I know that obviously that's some of what's informing both of your work. So when I saw this possibility for synergy between your books, I got really excited. So I'm delighted to have you both here. I want to encourage folks who are watching at home. We have a great, robust audience in the chat. Please feel free to ask questions. If you like, you can put them in the chat or you can put them in the ask a question box. But otherwise, just kick back and enjoy yourselves. I know this is going to be a great conversation. Thank you both.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Yay. First of all, I love your shirt. Like, you've got Frankenstein, and like I have a universal monster. So like,
oh my God, yes. And these earrings are for you. These are supposed to be a little vampire-y because they have a point. So.
Love it.
I love that. Is that a shirt or a dress?
I mean, it's a dress. It's kind of a short dress, though. So I think when I've worn it before, somebody's been like, nice shirt. And I'm like, thanks.
I always have to wear dresses and shirts. They never, the short ones, they never work. Yeah.
So I am so excited to be talking about your book. Yay. So.
And your book.
Oh, yay. Yeah, this is just an amazing book. This is such a wonderful idea. I was so excited whenever my publicist was like, Unwieldy Creatures, and I'm like, this is incredible. So if you want to get started here, I just want to ask you, like, when did you first come to Frankenstein? Like, did you see the movie first, or did you read the book? Like, what was your first exposure to it?
So actually, my first exposure to it was in a romantics lit course in college. So I always like to say that I was the same age Shelley was when she wrote it. So I was 19. And what's funny about it is that I actually wasn't in class for the actual discussion for Frankenstein. I was sick that day or something. And this was in the late 90s. So this was actually, you did go to office hours in order to get lecture notes. The internet existed, but it was literally for 5 minutes. It was in the world. So, so my teacher had me come to his office, and he just just did the lecture in front of me, and I took notes. But he said something very specific that sort of made me fixate on it in a different way than when I first read it. And what he said was, Shelley refers to the creature as the creature until the village, turns against him. And it's from that point that Shelley calls him the demon, the ogre, the wretch. And so that she literally turns him into the projections of the outside world. And there was just something about that moment that really stuck with me. And so I just found that really interesting. But there are other things about the book at that time and at that age that were just really helpful for me. So, as a biracial person in a world where biraciality was deeply stigmatized, never talked about, I really related to the creature's tale of alienation as an identical twin, where twins had only been dealt with in these sort of like trope-like ways. I really liked the way Shelley sort of had this duality happening between Frankenstein and the creature, so that they sort of end up saying the same things about the world, and was born from two very narcissistic parents. So I was also interested in the narcissism of it. So that was the beginning of it. And it wasn't something I like deeply stayed with, but it was just, I really was interested in the book. It was really compelling to me. And then in my, coming back to narcissism, in my late 20s, I broke up with this. So it was kind of wild. So I broke up with this narcissistic painter. That relationship basically ended surrounding an abortion. We were working on a painting and writing show on Frankenstein when we broke up. And so I like to tell like young audiences that I then read Frankenstein as self-help. So then I was like, how do I get away from continuing to date narcissists? I'm going to reread Frankenstein. And at that point I was, scanning it, reading it, taking notes about the way that narcissism shows up in the book, thinking about the male hysteria in the book, just sort of doing this sort of intense thing. And around that time, I just decided, this would make a great choreographic work. No one had done it yet. And I approached a choreographer who had already been doing adaptations. He had adapted Titus. He had done work on Mozart. He had done Romeo and Juliet in really psychologically invested ways. And so I thought he would be up for it. I pitched it to him cold, had no previous relationship to him at all. And then we co-created a production of Frankenstein that was also informed by Shelley's relationship with Percy, the Claire Claremont stuff, stuff with Mary Wollstonecraft. And so like in that time, I started that was when I started reading every single thing I could find about Frankenstein. So I was reading Wollstonecraft, I was reading Shelley, I was reading anything that was sort of dealing with the world of it. And then that was a decade ago. And then 3 years ago in 2019, okay, I'm almost done with this story. So 2019, I thought I was about to enter into IVF with my ex-spouse, who I would learn shortly after this was a pathological liar. And so we were about to enter into IVF, and, we were taking all the tests and doing all the things. And it's interesting that we're having this conversation on the platform of a Georgia-based bookstore, because the southern area that they're in is loosely based on Georgia, even though I don't name Georgia in the book, because at that time that I was writing it, the reproductive rights were being really challenged only in Georgia. Well, not only, but, very, very actively in Georgia. And so I thought, this would be a really great landscape for looking at. In vitro has become so accessible that I thought, this is a really interesting technological moment to look at in vitro in this kind of Frankensteinian landscape, with the technology is getting to a place where we're asking similar questions, I feel like, that Shelley was asking around the Industrial Revolution. So the technology that I bring into Unwieldy Creatures, though, I initially made up and then basically found out it was real. I was like, oh, I want to do something where they can create an embryo without sperm. And then I just like, let me just see. I'm just going to look it up and just see, and had no idea that this was not only a thing, but had been reported on. They had successfully been able to do this with mice experiment. So that's, and then I'd always wondered what would happen if we turned Frankenstein into a woman. What would happen if we, queered this very cis male universe? Also, Shelley kills off basically almost all. She ultimately kills off all the women. So I was like, what would happen if gender was used in a more subversive way? And more complicated than I think Shelley's time could have sort of handled. So that's like the ultimate Frankenstein narrative. And what about, I'm curious also about you, because Reluctant Immortals isn't only looking at Dracula, it's also looking at Jane Eyre. I don't think these are two worlds people would have naturally thought of as going together. So I'm curious, did you start with Dracula, or did you start with Jane Eyre? Did they come together? And then one final question for now is just, what made you decide to use Lucy as the protagonist and not some other part of those canons?
Yeah. So, I came to Jane Eyre and Dracula separately. I came to Dracula first because of the films. I remember watching the Universal film and the Hammer film when I was a kid. The Hammer film was always my favorite. No offense, Bela Lugosi, I like you too. But I loved the Hammer films. They were very vibrant, the Technicolor. I've always loved bright colors. And so I remember being very young and coming to Dracula that way. And then my parents, always had a lot of books around, and I understood that it was based on a book. And so I would always ask about the female characters. I'd always be like, who are the female characters in every story? I'd be asking my parents. And I remember my mom being like, there's only two in Dracula. There's Mina and there's Lucy. And I'm like, oh, well, what happens to them? And it's like, well, Mina lives and Lucy dies. And I'm like, oh. And I remember feeling just so sad that it's like, oh, well, why does Lucy have to die? And I remember I was probably like 5 years old. And I just remember always thinking about that. And then a lot of the film adaptations that I was seeing when I was young didn't really do a lot with Lucy. And then really, I still think the best film adaptation with Lucy is Coppola's version, Bram Stoker's Dracula with Sadie Frost. I feel like she's the most nuanced version of Lucy in all the film adaptations that I've seen anyways. I'm trying to see most of them at this point, but even then, that almost left me wanting even more, because I'm like, I want her to be in it so much more. I loved her performance, and I loved the way they interpreted the character. And so it really stayed with me that, I felt like there was so much more for Lucy to say. And it seemed like she was being punished because she had fun. She was a fun character. She was okay with having a bunch of men pursuing her, as opposed to, just being like, oh, just one suitor, like how Mina is. And I felt like there was that kind, as I got older, I felt like there was this kind of punishment because she was a woman who was sexual. And in the original Dracula, there's this great line that, she even says about oh, why can't a woman marry 3 men? And it's like, it's amazing to me, that still for a lot of people would be salacious thing to say to this day, but let alone in the late 1800s. And so I felt in many ways that because, Mina was more well-behaved, she got to live, and Lucy was killed off. And that always made me sad. And so I wrote a short story called The 8 People Who Murdered Me, excerpt from Lucy Westnera's diary a few years ago. And that was really the start of really trying to establish Lucy's voice and really, you know, exploring her character. And when I was done with that, I really was like, I want to know more about her, even though, you know, I'd written this short story, but I felt like I could say more with the character because I just wanted to spend more time with the character. And meanwhile, like I came to Jane Eyre a little bit later. I think I was like 10, 12 years old, somewhere in between there, again, through film. Like I'm a big film fan, obviously a big literature fan, but I just really love film as well. I remember watching it with my dad, the Orson Welles, Joan Fontaine version. It was like Saturday afternoon. And we came in the middle of it, and my dad, like, always was so great at narrating things. So if like you came into the middle of it, he could make it sound like so great. And it's a great story anyways, but he's like, okay, and here's where we are in this story. And it's like we're getting close to the point where, you know, Bertha shows up. But then when she does, and this is even in the original novel, she's not in it very much. You never get anything from her perspective. It's very much what everyone's saying about her. And in that version, she's just like a shadowy extra. She just like kind of like creeps by real quick. We never see her face, and it's just how people are reacting to her. So again, I'm like, I want to know more about her. I want to know more about this character and like why, you know, it seemed like everybody's like, well, of course you put this woman in an attic. And it's like, well, that seems like really terrible. That seems like the worst possible fate for a person. But it was like, of course, this is what you do to her. And so that like was very scary to me. And again, like being like, you know, this is, a lot of people don't consider the Brontes horror, but I totally do. I think Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre are absolutely horror. A lot of people be like, oh, Gothic, but Gothic romance. I'm like, Gothic romance and horror. They can be all of them together. And I very much feel like they are. And so it was kind of these parallel tracks of these two characters that both of them I wanted to know more about. And when I finished up the story on Lucy and it was coming out, the short story, I was like, you know, I really want to spend more time with her. And I was like, well, I guess I could do a novel, but I had just written, you know, this story and I didn't want it to just be about her. And I thought, you know, the whole thing with her is that I feel like she's a forgotten character. And then I immediately thought of Bertha from Jane Eyre. And I'm like, you know, this would be really interesting to see these two characters that, again, like you said, I don't think a lot of people think of Dracula and Jane Eyre as being that similar. And yet I think there are some beats within those stories that do share a lot of similarities. And I'm like, really want to see them come together. And I really just want to see how they would be together, and just kind of exploring that of like these two women that have similar experiences, yet in some ways are completely different because, you know, and in both of the original stories, they're both socialites initially. Like Lucy is a wealthy socialite and Bertha is as well in Spanish Town. Like she actually does come from money, and yet, you know, I grew up very working class. And so it was always like, oh, if you have money, it'll save you. That's always like the thing you kind of think when you're young, like, oh, well, in stories or in the real world. But like these characters, because of gender, and with Bertha also because of race, you know, she it doesn't save either one of them. You know, even that, you know, the limitations of the time and still the limitations we have now wasn't, you know, they still ended up being punished for what was seen as kind of transgressions. And then to your other question, so I feel like because I had already written the short story from Lucy's perspective, I felt like I really had, like, I had that kind of in already. And I felt like, okay, this is the character. This is the one I want to do as the viewpoint character. I felt like I could really kind of sink into that and really explore it from her perspective, since I already had the short story and her voice pretty well established. And it's very much a continuation of that short story.
I'm trying to think what else I want to ask you. I have so many questions. So, you know, one question I have is, how did you decide on the geographical world of and the temporal world? So we're in the 60s and we go from, I feel like, LA to the Bay, right? So did that happen in the short story, or how did you decide where all these characters were kind of thrashed around, you know?
The short story based on Lucy was based in the same time period and place as Dracula. So it was England in the Victorian era. So again, I was thinking, I could do it in that time period, but I'm fascinated by American history as an American, because I think that it's like there are things we've done right, and there's a lot of things we've done wrong. And I feel like in the 1960s, it was this moment of a lot of social change. And some of those things we've delivered on the promise of, and some of it, of the peace and love and the things that people wanted, we have not delivered on at all. And to me, it's such an interesting time frame. And thinking about these characters and trying to have them reclaim who they are, it made a lot of sense to me to like put them in this place where people were looking for freedom and they were looking for answers, and these characters were as well. And so that was, and I've always, again, been fascinated by the 1960s. And then I love California. I think California, I've said this several times, like, I feel like it's a place, but in some ways it's a promise. It's a place that like has a lot of promise. People go out to Los Angeles with hopes of, stardom. Or I was a Steinbeck fan growing up, and I always think of The Grapes of Wrath and how everybody was heading to California during the Depression because they were hoping there was something waiting there for them. And so I was thinking a lot about that as I was writing this, and like the promise that, Lucy and B, she goes by the name B in this, Bertha does, and the hope that they have for themselves as they are living there. So how about
it's
you?
Also, no, well, okay. Well, I just wanted to comment. Well, it's also interesting is that because it's like this era of free love, I feel like it also opens up other characters to these men in a way that maybe in a different era, it might not actually feel as realistic, but there's an intimacy there that then becomes, exploited later. Yeah.
And that's such an interesting thing about that era, because I do think the idea of allowing people, free love, like you said, is a good thing, but it can also be used exploitively. And that was something I was thinking a lot about, that, obviously there was better birth control methods at that point. There were a lot of things that were really good. But then, there were some people who used that as like, oh, well, I can kind of exploit people because of how open everyone is. So absolutely, that was very much something that I was thinking about as I was writing. So how about you? So your setting for Unwieldy Creatures, like, how did you get there?
Yeah, so I always write biracial Asian characters. My father's Chinese, my mother is, I like to call myself Appalachian because my mother's from Nashville, Tennessee, and and I'm writing these characters into books because I didn't get them and still don't get them as much as I would like. So I knew I wanted Frankenstein to come from a biracial Asian background. And then I sort of thought, for this book, I just kind of wanted to work with a less familiar Asian identity than mine only. And so Indonesia was just something I kind of wanted, something a little less familiar, but still familiar enough. I've known people from Singapore and Indonesia, so I had a little bit of familiarity. So that's sort of how Indonesia sort of came alive. And then I'm trying to think. I'm not sure where West Texas came from. I don't know. I think I wanted Texas in there. I'm not really sure how that happened. That just sort of happened. And then I really wanted a lot of it to be unspecified. So I didn't really, because the diction is a sort of mashup. I don't know if you could tell, but it is intentionally a mashup between Shelley's language and a kind of contemporary language. And I didn't think I would be able to get away with it if we were too rooted in a contemporary place and age. So I try to use more geographic areas. So, the South, we don't ever really know exactly where in the South the current part of the story is. But Plum, who is the narrator intern, who replaces the Robert Walton figure in the original, she is from Vermont. Some of these things were things that, like, my editor was sort of like, you need to give us a little bit more than you have given us right now. And I think that the thing I liked about West Texas was you could kind of give it this sort of surreal landscape, because West Texas does have this kind of surreality to it. It's less metropolitan. And then Plum's character, I made her Taiwanese American, which, you know, is pretty closely connected to my background. And so I wanted there to be sort of like multiple Asian identities that were working in the book. I think the other reason that I used Texas was because I wanted Z, who is our Frankenstein figure, I wanted her father to come from this sort of problematic white masculinity that would create a sort of framework for why she becomes toxic and difficult. So I wanted the sort of the way that whiteness has informed her life to sort of work its way into how she sort of chases ambition and, you know, stops caring about her responsibility to the people that she claims to care about, that she claims are priorities for her. So, yeah.
Very good. Very, very nice. So, female mad scientists, like, I don't feel like there's enough of them. For like the last like year or so, I've been kicking around this idea of doing a female mad scientist. So like when I read this, I was so incredibly excited. So like, thoughts on it? Like, do you have favorite female mad scientists in literature? Or, you know, I think there should be a lot more. So like every time I come across one, I'm very, very excited. So just thoughts broadly on the topic.
Oh my God, I'm going to have to think about that one for a minute, because there aren't.
There aren't a lot. Yeah.
Like, do you have favorites? Have you been doing research?
You know, no, I really don't necessarily have favorites. The one that always pops to mind for me, and it's so male gaze, is Poison Ivy from Batman. I mean, but I don't feel like we ever focus enough on the science part of it. She is a scientist, but I feel like once she kind of gets turned into a villain, we kind of end up, that falls away a little bit, at least in the interpretations I've seen of her, which is not necessarily like, I don't know everything about Batman, but like.
Did you ever watch the animated series?
I did, but it's been years. It's been years. Okay.
There is one episode. It's actually kind of funny because I briefly thought I might become a therapist, and I had gone to this like very hippie sort of weird, I was going to call it an audition. It wasn't an audition. It was a campus interview in Santa Barbara. And they're pretty well known, but they're like a union institute called Pacifica. And it reminded me of this very specific animated series episode that involves Poison Ivy, where Bruce Wayne goes to this spa, and he thinks he's just at a spa, and he drinks this water from the fountain, supposed to be Fountain of Youth, and basically it's this trick by Poison Ivy to keep Batman there so she can go off and do things. But it's like, I think it might be interesting to you because she creates this basically potion that, you know, prevents, like, I think they go into a deep sleep, but they're also incredibly happy, so they forget everything they're supposed to be doing. Okay. So it has this kind of like scientific sort of, you know. It is.
Yeah. That brings the background into it a little bit, because a lot of times it was just like, oh, she's just going to be bad. But I'm like, but she's a scientist. She's like a female mad scientist. And I feel like they are mostly male. So what was your like inspiration for creating your version of Frankenstein?
You know, I didn't really... I know this is going to sound terrible, but I really didn't want to read a lot of retellings of Frankenstein because I was afraid they would get in my head. So, you know, even though Branagh is sort of understandably, a lot of people can sort of push back on what he likes to do, which is when he does his adaptations, his film adaptations of classics, you know, he's notorious for adapting every single exact moment. His Hamlet was 4 hours long, had an intermission in the theater. But I like his Frankenstein. The creature is really marvelously played by Robert De Niro. Branagh almost always plays the main character of his adaptations. Helena Bonham Carter plays the bride, even though the bride is, is from the film world, it's not from the original. So that was an important inspiration to me. But really, I read every single, so I worked a chapter at a time. So I would reread a Frankenstein chapter, and then I would sort of think about it. I knew I wanted to gender swap everybody. And I'm trying to, so there's not like Frankensteinian inspirations as much as there are these other weird things I put in there. So, for example, the creature is raised in the woods by somebody who lives in the woods. And I think the film is called Leave No Trace, but it's about this vet and his daughter who the vet just emotionally can't handle, like living in a more traditional way. And so he and his daughter live in the woods until the authorities find them, and they sort of offer some social services, but he's still unable to handle it. But the daughter really enjoys the support and resources that she's getting. And so they make this decision to separate. So it was things like that. Like I would think, it would be really interesting to have the creature live in that environment. And so it was, so there are like little inspirations like that. But there's nobody that really directly inspired I'm trying to think of that. There's, it was pretty much just, so there were a couple of things I was thinking about throughout writing the book. One was, what happens when I both swap the genders, but also, this happened in the original. What am I going to have happen differently in this book? And then also everything for me was about the ideologies that were embedded in the original and how I was going to kind of subvert them or problematize them in a contemporary retelling. But I would say that the Frankenstein figure, she was the hardest because there's all this pressure. I mean, just like what you were saying about there not being enough mad women scientists, there's always this pressure for these underrepresented characters to be heroic or be perfect. I was worried about people saying like, oh, like you're making this, fucked up female, monster scientist. So I was, just sort of constantly trying to make sure that she is complicated and her story, there's a clear path for how her story develops. And there's something else I was going to say. And then, and then it was really important to me that this particular Frankenstein actually ends in a much more redemptive place than the original Frankenstein, where, so.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, it's just, like I said, it's just a beautiful, incredible retelling, and you go at it in such an interesting way. And I can see how there's so many influences and how much you love the original, and then, like you said, trying to subvert it and trying to find those beats of like what can we add to it from a contemporary point of view. Because it's always interesting to me when you look at some of these Gothic stories and like, Mary Shelley was doing so many things with Frankenstein that were very daring at the time. But then now some of those things have become problematic, right? And I mean, they were then, but like we see them as being more problematic now. And whenever I was writing with Jane Eyre, it was the same thing. There's a lot of things at the time that were so incredibly feminist and different. But now, I go back and I still love Jane Eyre, but it's like her relationship with Rochester is very toxic. It's a toxic relationship. His relationships with everyone are toxic. So to me, it's so interesting to go back even to these very feminist stories for their time and see like, how have we progressed? How have we not progressed? In some ways we haven't, but in other ways it's like, I think we can do maybe better now that we hopefully understand these things a little more.
It's also really interesting, like, and I'm kind of curious to hear you talk about how Lucy and Bea are both struggling with their relationships with men, various men, but they respond to that and ambivalence, I guess, in different ways.
Yes.
You know, I'm just wondering, like, how early in the writing of this did you start to distinguish how they would be similar and how they would kind of like separate, you know?
Yes. So to me, there's like, I feel like there's like the three reactions to kind of these toxic men. There's the way my version of Jane Eyre reacts, the way that Lucy reacts, and the way that Bertha reacts. And it's like, this is a little bit of a spoiler, but not too much. Jane, in my version, is still very wrapped up in this very toxic relationship. And I feel like that's this stage when you're not out of this relationship yet, when you're still really wrapped up in this person that even if you consciously know they're terrible for you, you're struggling to get out of it. And with that, I love that you brought up something that was completely unrelated to Frankenstein with the Leave No Trace, because when I was writing this, because, you know, there's a cult vibe in what Rochester is doing in Reluctant Immortals. And I went to the movie, and a lot of people didn't talk about it, and it makes me sad because I love Elizabeth Olsen, and I feel like everybody's talking about her now. There's a movie called Martha, Marcy, May, Marlene that was about, you know, she's this cult survivor trying to deal with the fallout. And I was thinking a lot about that, and that was really, you know, an inspiration for my version of Jane in Reluctant Immortals, as somebody who you can tell, you know, her character in Martha, Marcy, May, Marlene really did have, you know, she was a very strong-willed person. She was very, you know, free-spirited. And then she got into this cult, and she's very damaged when we come into the movie, and is dealing with that and trying to figure out how to navigate that. And that was really where I was with Jane, as, you know, we come into Reluctant Immortals when we meet her. Then Lucy, I kind of think, is almost at the next place with a toxic relationship. And obviously these things aren't necessarily linear. You can go back and forth in toxic relationships. But with Lucy, she's at this place, she knows Dracula is awful. Like, she understands that. She's pulled herself out of this relationship to some extent. But then she's still got this kind of attraction to him. So there's still this back and forth between them. She's pulled herself mostly out of it. She's guarding his ashes throughout the story, you know, trying to keep him from like coming back and rising from the dead again. But at the same time, there is still that attraction. And, you know, she still talks to him even in the urns. And there's this kind of very bad relationship, but she knows it's a bad relationship, and she's more out of it than Jane is, but not quite as out of this bad relationship as she'd like to be. Then I feel like B's at the end of it, that she's just like, I hate Rochester. I know that he was super toxic. He put me in an attic. He's a bad person. And it's like being at that stage where I feel like, you know, if you fully escaped a toxic relationship, that's oftentimes where you kind of end up with it, of like, wow, this person was just really terrible. This is a thing that happened to me, but I can really see it more from a kind of distant perspective of like, this is just a really bad relationship. And so I was thinking a lot about that in the toxic relationships I've had, because I feel like I've been at that point, you know, at each of those points in these relationships that I've gotten out of, and, you know, fortunately years ago now, thankfully, but, you know, really thinking about, how did I feel when I was at that place where Jane was, where you're still really wrapped up in this person, even though you know it's not good for you? Or when you're at the place with Lucy, where it's like, I'm out, but I'm still attracted to this person, even though I know I shouldn't be. And then when you finally get to the point where B is like, I just hate this guy. Like, he's just terrible. He's just the worst. And so really playing with those different stages of being in or out of a toxic relationship.
It's also interesting because B and Jane and Lucy and Dracula also have this battle of identifying with one another as being from these like sort of similar experiences, and how the push and pull happens differently at different times. But it's an interesting, like, I just find it to be like a really interesting parallel there. There's something else I was going to ask you. So I felt like I had a lot of freedom because I didn't use canon characters, right? Like, I used representation. So did you struggle, like, you know, once you decided to go, because I don't think people are doing what you're doing as much anymore with retellings, right? They're often creating their own universe, their own, you know, cast of characters that are sort of intersecting with the original. And I imagine that when you use the characters from the original, there's I mean, you know, fans are intense, right? But also, I thought that you just really beautifully bring in enough of the original stories that I don't think anyone will feel the need to have to read them in order to read Reluctant Immortals, but hopefully they'll just be drawn to read them if they happen to have not, you know, experienced Jane Eyre or Dracula yet.
Yeah, that was definitely something I was thinking of when I was writing this, of like, write it just in case somebody either hasn't read Jane Eyre or Dracula, or they haven't recently, and still make it so you can read Reluctant Immortals without having read them. But like you said, I mean, I definitely hope people seek them out, especially, you know, I feel like everybody kind of has an idea of Dracula. I feel like most people have at least a general idea, but like, I mean, I think most people know Jane Eyre, and I think most people know the Mad Woman in the Attic, but maybe not the specifics. So yeah, I definitely hope that people would go back to the originals, because obviously they are so great. And yeah, you know, writing characters that, you know, are canon. Like you said, some people do get upset. They do. They're like, you know, no. But, you know, I'm always like this. I'm that's fine. Like, this is I feel like when you're doing a retelling, you obviously, people need to know that there is an original, right? That's how it works. So it's not like this is going to obliterate the original. Of course it's not. That's not going to happen. It's just an interpretation. And so that's something that I'm always, you know, I love retellings. I just think they're the greatest. Like, I love fairy tale retellings. I love retellings of Gothic stories, anything in the public domain. I'm like, yes, even if it's something that, like, I don't like the way it's retold, I'm just happy that retellings exist, because I think that they're just so fun, because it's like, I feel like it's like our own folklore. We all have this kind of folklore of these, you know, stories. And so it's like, we just get to build on our own folklore in like real time. So for me, that's just so much fun. And I just enjoy it so incredibly much. So yeah.
I actually when I started writing fiction, it was really, we didn't call it fanfic then, but they were basically very bad twin fanfics of Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles, which I was obsessed with. So it was like Queen of the Damned, but the first vampires were twins, and
yeah, they were. And I was really disappointed in like there was a film version of Queen of the Damned, and they didn't do the twins at all, right? Like
no, yeah.
That was like so sad. I was like so disappointed by that, because I remember, again, like I was like really young when my mom was reading those, but like, again, she was a really good storyteller too. So like, I always loved when my parents would like narrate these like things that maybe I was too young to read, but she like told me all about Anne Rice's book. So I remember being like, ooh, the twins, like, you know, how did you feel like as a twin, how did you feel those twins were interpreted?
That's a good question. I'm gonna have to reread it, because I don't think I was particularly salty about twins rep at that time. I probably was just like so thirsty for any twin representation that it was really important to me. But I was always mad at the Parent Trap, and I was always mad at the twins in the background of Saved by the Bell, who literally only exist to say things in unison, dressed identically.
I forgot about that.
Yeah. What else? I was going to ask you something else. Speaking of sort of Anne Rice, I don't want to spoil anything, but there is an interesting queerness that happens in the book.
That was the next thing I was going to ask you about yours. I love this.
So I'm wondering, you know, like, I don't know how you want to, you know, navigate spoilers or not spoilers, but so I'm curious how you decided to make that choice also, but I think that you're going to understand. I'm going to say this in code, to do that with those two characters and not with perhaps two other characters that we might have thought originally would end up there. Yeah.
Did my screen just look really okay? I thought so. Like, I'm just gonna leave it. I'm purple right now. I have no idea why. Like, my onboard.
It feels fitting.
That is. There we go. I look Technicolor purple. At least it's working. So okay, I'm purple. Hello, everyone. Okay. So yeah. So I'm I'm okay with spoiling it. There is a relationship. It's like a couple chapters in, but I'm okay with spoiling it. I think some people have talked about it already anyways in some of the reviews, but there is a relationship between Bertha and Jane that is like part of the kind of heartbreak for B's character, is that not only has she been kind of separated from herself and had this horrible thing happen to her, she's lost somebody that she's very much cared about. And yeah, that was just something that I felt like I feel like even you go back to the original Jane Eyre and how fascinated Jane is with this kind of like, she knows there's somebody, she gets this feeling there's somebody in the house, and she's, and this interest that she has in her. And then also the interest in the original Jane Eyre that Bertha has in Jane. Like she goes, when she gets out, she like rips her veil. Like there's definitely this relationship between them, even though they don't really spend any time together. And so to me, it was like, looking for those places that, to be able to queer original text, because there isn't a lot of queer original text. There just isn't. There's a lot of things that have been suppressed or was never allowed to be published, and being able to look at those places where you can develop those types of relationships. So that was, that was just something I was really excited about being able to explore, and also setting it in the 1960s in a time of free love. Even though there wasn't as much acceptance of LGBTQ relationships then as there are certainly in some places now. Certainly there's not in some other places now, but, I did feel like I could work with that better than, say, if I said it in the Victorian time, or if I said it even in the 50s, for example, it would be a little bit more difficult. And so it felt like at least that late 1960s, there would be more kind of acceptance in kind of San Francisco for that relationship. And it wasn't necessarily going to be something that everybody would be commenting on, because that was something I didn't actually do a lot of in Reluctant Immortals. People don't really comment on it that much. There's not like a lot of, overt homophobia about it. It's just kind of like, even with Rochester, he's more just irritated with them as that he can't control them, that it's more the lack of control. Even as evil as he is in my version, there's not a lot of overt homophobia in it, because I feel like in the late 1960s, there may not have been in certain places. Again, in other places, there obviously still is. So that's definitely not, it wasn't not perfect, right? We're not living in a perfect time by any stretch, but I felt like with free love that maybe there would be a little bit more acceptance of it, and it wouldn't be necessarily commenting as much on it. So how about you? Like, what were your thoughts in terms of, queering Frankenstein? Because I was just so excited about that. That was just so great.
Yeah. I always knew I wanted to make a queer Frankenstein. That was just, something that really appealed to me. And queering, and obviously we're both sort of doing that, right? Like queering the text, queering the original, but also queering both the captain intern character Plum, and queering Frankenstein. I would also say, if anybody asked me, I would say that Ezra is also queer, but has taken the other route and has deeply suppressed it after the way that his father has treated him around things that could be considered traditionally effeminate. So I feel like Frankenstein is already really gay. I think that the way that the captain talks about Frankenstein is gay. I think the way that Victor talks about his best friend Henry is gay. I think it's really interesting that he's way more obsessed with Henry than he seems to be about Elizabeth. Understandably, he's basically being forced to marry his sister. So this is something we never talk about, which is why it's very much in the book in this way, because if we read Frankenstein today, we would be like, this is strange. Why is his betrothed like his adoptive sister? So I think that Frankenstein is already reads very queer in a certain way. And also I wanted to kind of look at the idea of reproductive technology in particular around what it would provide for queer couples, so that, she ends up thinking she's doing this really great thing for, for herself and for other queer people, but gets, sort of self-obsessed and kind of loses her way. I would say with Ash, who is the creature, that I felt like if the creature is not being socialized, why would the creature identify with cisgender? It didn't make sense to me. And so that's why I wanted the creature specific. I always knew that the creature was going to be non-binary. And and I think like what I wanted to show in Frankenstein was that there are different relationships that queer people have to their identities, and they run, you know, and they run the umbrella, and they're not going to all be positive. They're not going to all be redemptive. It's very complicated, and they're coming from, you know, complicated places, complicated parents. And, you know, I agree with a lot of people feel like don't always tell the coming out story. And so, you know, I wanted to show a kind of complexity throughout the characters, that there is a coming out story, but that is not the only point of the story. This is not, I don't want to say this in a spoilery way, but I will just say that the story ends with the concept of queer family. And that was something that I really wanted to sort of change about the way that we see the way the original plays out.
Yeah. You know, I feel like we're only just now really in literature, really being able to embrace queer identity in an overt way. I feel like so much of queer literature, not all of it, certainly not all of it. There's definitely some out there, but I feel like broadly defined, it's like right now is like this moment where we're actually able to write as, you know, the stories and not, you know, be as afraid, not having to put them under a pseudonym, for example, you know, or anything like that. So it's interesting to me, like this moment of like, you know, and like you said, a lot of times it's like, don't tell the coming out story. But it's like, what if you want to tell the coming out story? We don't have a lot, you know, we don't have as much literature as we should, because it has been suppressed. And so that is something that, you know, it's hard. It's tough. It's tough being able to, you know, be at this moment that we can talk about it, but also at the same time be at a moment where legislatively, especially in America, there's so much, you know, it feels like we can talk about it openly, but at the same time we can't. It's such a weird point to be at right now to be able to write, you know, queer literature. So, and I think you do it so well in this.
Thank you so much. You know, and all, you know, what's also been really inspiring about reading yours is I do have this like new idea of a retelling-ish thing to do with like a love story between Mary Shelley and Anne Lister. And Anne Lister is the Gentleman Jack, you know, figure from the HBO show. And I was looking her up, and she absolutely wrote about reading Frankenstein in her diary. And but the other thing I found out is that Mary Shelley actually apparently helped bring lesbians to asylum. Like she would help transport them. So I thought it could be cool to like create some sort of like imaginary like queer romance between them. so but I was like feeling nervous about it, you know, about actually like using these kind of like full-blown identities or whatever. So this book really helped me think about ways like you can sort of play into what's already been written through these actual, like through the actual characters, but also create like a new world for them, you know. Oh yeah, look, somebody would read it.
I would. That's two people who would read it. That sounds amazing. That sounds so incredible. I did not know that about Mary Shelley, that she would help get people to.
It was very recent. I just like looked up the two of them. I was just kind of curious if I would find anything, and somebody had written about them. So, you know, we have about 6 minutes left or so, and I'm just kind of curious if you have questions. I mean, we can pretty much talk forever. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Yeah. It's kind of funny how our titles are really similar too.
Yeah.
Thinking about that too. Yeah, they're structured in a similar way. Yeah.
That's great. So weird. My purple, like, I saw it flashing like lately, and I was like, oh, I'm sure it's okay. And then all of a sudden, at least it didn't go out completely, but it is kind of spooky. Unless I saw.
I love it. It looks intentional.
That's right. Like, oh, this is my Zoom background. Like, no, it's not. I don't know what's happened to my camera, but at least I'm visible.
Feels like something Elvira would do suddenly, and just with her
it
look
is.
here. Any other suggestions of other queer horror?
I'm gonna plug your book that you guys are doing an event for here shortly. It came from the closet. Yes. I cannot wait to read this. It's nonfiction, and it's, yeah. Do you want to talk about it? Because it is all nonfiction.
Yeah, sure.
Right? It's all nonfiction essays, correct?
Yeah. So I have an essay in this really incredible anthology called "It Came from the Closet: Queer Reflections on Horror." It comes out October 4th, I believe. We are doing an online event with, it will be me and 3 other authors. I want to say I think it's October 10th. But they're basically all personal essays from queer writers about their relationship to a very specific horror film. I wrote about Dead Ringers because I'm a twin, and usually when I'm not writing about Frankenstein, I'm usually writing about twins. But there's some really great pieces in here. Some really great writers. Carmen Maria Machado is in it. Let's see, Viet Din, who is a big horror fanatic, is in here. Zephyr Lazalski, if you know her, she's a really incredible trans writer who writes a lot about horror. She actually has an incredible book of poems about Lizzie Borden. I think it's called Blood. I can't remember. It's called Blood Box, I think, which is really incredible. But yeah, I would, and what's really cool about the essays in this book is that they really run the gamut in terms of what types of films are being talked about. So The Exorcist, The Blob, Jennifer's Body, Eris Pupa, I think it's called, Get Out, Halloween, Eyes Without a Face. So, there are some really sort of esoteric films in there and some sort of classic horror films and all sort of different perspectives. Joe Valise edited it, and he also has some work in there. So yeah, so I think I'm really excited about this book. I feel really honored to be part of it, and I would definitely recommend that. I think they're actually doing an audiobook right now. So there's definitely going to be an audiobook version, and some really great, what are the people called that do that? Voice actors? I don't know.
Yeah, voice actors.
Narrators.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm trying to think what else, who else is, do you have some other favorite queer horror?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much out there. I mean, you brought up, Carmen Maria Machado has done some amazing queer horror. One of the books I've always brought up, I've Sarah Tantlinger's To Be Devoured, but it just went out of print. It was nominated for a Bram Stoker Award. It was a novella. I loved it. It was about vultures, and it was such a weird book, but it just went out of print. So if you can get a copy of it, it's got a vulture on the cover. I love that one. That's queer horror. So that one's a really great one. Can I talk about other books of the Brontë sisters? We're running out of time. I'm mostly a Jane Eyre person. I don't know. I don't think I've ever even read Wuthering Heights because once I learned about Heathcliff, I got so mad. And so I don't have as much knowledge about anyone other than Charlotte, and really Jane Eyre is my main thing. So I probably, I don't know, but I do what would happen if Catherine met Jane and Bertha. I don't know, maybe Catherine would fight back more. I was always sad when, Kathy was no, Kathy, don't die in Wuthering Heights. But yeah, I'm just mad at Heathcliff. I feel I ever since I've learned about Wuthering Heights, I'm Heathcliff. See, I could do something with that and be angry about that too, I am about Rochester.
It's funny. I'm the same way. I only like Jane Eyre. I mean, Jane Eyre is still really complicated, but I'm just not interested in the other books that much.
Yeah, I'm not. I need to learn more, especially since I have written now, a Jane Eyre retelling. I need to get more into the other Brontë sisters because I find their lives were fascinating. They had fascinating lives. They lived very non-conventional lives at a time when that really wasn't what was done. So I do need to know more. I know they have a new biopic coming out about Emily. but it's like not accurate. It's like one of those like reimaginings. But again, I'm like totally cool with that. Like I'm good with that. I know some people are like, oh, it's totally different. I'm like, I don't care. Like it's like, you know, it's the idea of it. But any other final questions? All right, so let's bring ER back in. We gotta summon. There we go. Yay!
Thank you both so much. This was so fun. So I want to encourage folks, if you do not have your copy yet of Reluctant Immortals or Unwieldy Creatures, you can click this teal button at the bottom center of the screen. It will take you to the landing page that has both of their books. It actually has also their backlist. So if you already have your copies of these books, but you're like, oh, cool, I don't have their other books, go there, get their old books, read the backlist, order It Came from the Closet. I dropped that link for the event in there where you can buy that book and join us on October 10th. We also are hosting Clay McLeod, I'm forgetting his whole name, and Rachel Harrison on September 29th in terms of other horror. And that new book is also about complicated relationship dynamics between it's basically about a woman who is in a troubled relationship with a man who's an addict, and he dies and reanimates himself in some kind of way. So that'll be fun on September 29th, but it's using horror to explore relationship dynamics. So if that's your vibe, join us for that. If this is your first time coming to Charis, please check out our full list of events on our website, which is charisbooksandmore.com. We're Charis Books and More on all platforms except for Twitter, which is at Charis Circle. Do y'all want to just shout out your social media handles and where you want folks to follow you?
I'm at yeah, you go ahead. You go first.
Oh, I was just gonna say I'm at Addie Brooke. I'll put it down here. ADDIEBROOK on Twitter. Blue Juniper JUNIPER on Instagram, and Addie Tsai on Facebook if anyone's doing that anymore. Yeah.
I'm at Gwendolyn Kiste on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And I also have a blog that I sometimes update. So gwendolynKiste.com.
Well, thank y'all both so much for this really great reading. And thanks to everybody watching at home. We hope that you stay safe and well, and we'd love to see you again soon. Addie, we will see you again soon, but Gwendolyn, we hope to have you back in the future.
Right, absolutely. That'd be great.
And maybe even in person sometime.
Yeah, yeah.
Until then, take care. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so